Hello, everyone, and welcome to our module on the cerebral cortex. So shown on this slide is a drawing of the cerebral cortex. It's the outermost layer of the brain, and as you can see depicted in this drawing, it's made up of a bunch of little peaks and valleys of brain tissue. Each of these peaks is called a gyrus. Multiple peaks are called gyri, and each of the valleys between peaks is called a sulcus. Multiple sulcuses are called sulci. So we say that the cerebral cortex is made up of gyri and sulci, and that's what you can see in this image on the screen here. Then we further divide the cerebral cortex up into lobes based on the bones of the skull that are closest to each section. So for example, in red is the frontal lobe. That's the section of the cerebral cortex closest to the frontal bone. In green, we have the parietal lobe. In yellow, we have the occipital lobe. And in this sort of bluish green color here, we have the temporal lobe. Notice also that the brainstem is down here with the spinal cord below that, and the cerebellum is shown in purple. And then I want to point out one special sulcus, and that's the central sulcus right here. It's what divides the green parietal lobe from the red frontal lobe. Just in front of the central sulcus in the frontal lobe in red here is a gyrus called the precentral gyrus. We'll talk about this later, but this is very important for motor control of our muscles. And it's found right in front of the central sulcus, so it's called the precentral gyrus. Also back here, we have a region of the parietal lobe found just on the other side of the central sulcus. That's called the postcentral gyrus. And this region is very important for sensory processing in the brain. We'll come back to all these things later, but I just want to point out the anatomy to you now. You should be aware that there's another way to divide up the portions of the cerebral cortex, and that's by dividing it up into Brodmann areas. These are 47 areas of the human brain. They're shown in the drawing here. This is something that we don't talk a lot about in neuroscience at the med student level, but you should have heard of this just so if someone mentions a part of the brain that's Brodmann area 8 or Brodmann area 21, they're talking about these Brodmann areas, which is a different way to classify brain structures. Okay, so now let's start talking about the different lobes of the cerebral cortex one at a time, and we'll start by discussing the frontal lobe. That's the lobe shown here in blue in this image. It's the largest lobe of the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. It's important for motor function, so there are cell bodies of neurons that control the muscles of our body found in the frontal lobe. It's also important for planning movements. And then there's a section of the frontal lobe that's very important for thinking and imagining and making decisions. We'll talk more about this in just a minute. There are a number of different areas of the frontal lobe, but the 4 really important ones you should be familiar with are all shown here. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is go through each of these areas one at a time. So we'll start by talking about the primary motor cortex, which I mentioned before. If you look at this drawing down at the bottom of the screen, which we've already seen, this is the central sulcus. And this gyrus right here, just on one side of the central sulcus, is called the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And there are cell bodies of neurons found here that control voluntary movements of muscles on the opposite side of the body. So the neurons found in the precentral gyrus on the left side of the brain control the right side of the body and vice versa. If you could cut out this precentral gyrus and turn it on its side, it would look like what I've shown here. And the different neurons that control the parts of the body are organized in a specific fashion that we call the homunculus or the little man. And that's what's shown in this drawing right here. So over here, sort of to the outside of the cerebral cortex, you find neurons that control muscles involved in the tongue and swallowing. Then as you go further up along the curvature of the frontal lobe, you find neurons that control muscles of the neck and face. Then you find the hand neurons, and then finally you find the legs over here. And this organizational structure shown here is called the homunculus. And this has clinical relevance because in other videos where I talk about strokes, the most common stroke subtype is a stroke of the middle cerebral artery, and that's going to affect this region right here. And so in middle cerebral artery strokes, you predominantly see symptoms of weakness involving the hands and the face and the neck and things like that. On the other hand, a less common stroke subtype is a stroke involving the anterior cerebral artery. It tends to affect this region over here more. And so in those types of strokes, you get symptoms that predominantly affect the lower limb, regions like the legs and the feet. Another important region of the frontal lobe is the frontal eye fields. These are found in Brodmann's area 8, one of those areas we talked about earlier. And the frontal eye fields are important for conjugate movement of the eyes to the opposite side. So by conjugate movement, I mean moving both eyes in the same direction, like moving both eyes to the left or both eyes to the right. And we have frontal eye fields in the left frontal lobe and the right frontal lobe. The left frontal eye fields control movement towards the right and vice versa, so to the opposite side. The frontal eye fields are also important for saccadic movements of the eyes. So when you're moving your eyes back and forth, like when you're reading, And the frontal eye fields are also important for tracking objects. So if you want your eyes to follow a moving object, the frontal eye fields coordinate that. And a key thing to know about the frontal eye fields is that when there's a lesion of the frontal eye fields on one side, the eyes will deviate toward that side, toward the affected side. The way you can think about this is if we have our two eyeballs, the frontal eye fields are pushing the eyes in this direction from one side, and then the other side frontal eye fields are pushing the eyes in this direction. So when you get a lesion, the other side is going to dominate and the eyes are going to deviate toward the side with the lesion. So for example, if this were the right eye and this were the left eye and we had a right frontal eye field lesion, this is how the eyes would deviate, shown here. And this can be important when you're trying to localize where a patient is having a stroke. If patients present with motor weakness, that can be due to a stroke involving the cortex or the brainstem or the spinal cord. How are you going to figure that out? Well, one way is by identifying a frontal eye field lesion. As soon as you see that, that is a so-called cortical sign. It means that the stroke involves the cerebral cortex. Specifically, it means that there's a lesion of the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Another important region of the frontal lobe is Broca's speech area. This is found in the frontal lobe in the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. You want to remember it's on the left side. They're going to show you questions on your exam where one choice is the left frontal lobe and one is the right. And for Broca's speech area, you want to pick the left. Broca's speech area coordinates speech production, not speech comprehension. That comes from a different region. We'll talk about that in a minute. So things that Broca's speech area coordinates are moving the muscles for speech and making sure that your speech is clear and fluent. So what this means is that if you have a lesion affecting Broca's speech area in the frontal lobe, you will get what's called an expressive aphasia. This occurs when patients know what they want to say, but they can't express it in speech. So they speak in short sentences, often with stutters and stops. To recognize this, you want to watch for patients who speak with broken speech, things like lots of stuttering and stops and starts. They're just having trouble forming that speech and getting the words out. That's a Broca's aphasia caused by a lesion of the Broca's speech area in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe. Related to a Broca's aphasia is another speech problem called a Wernicke's aphasia. This happens when there's a lesion in the temporal lobe of Wernicke's speech area. It's also found in the left hemisphere, but in the temporal lobe, not the frontal lobe. This region of our brain is responsible for speech comprehension, not production. Production is Broca's area. So when you have a lesion that affects the temporal lobe in the left hemisphere, the patient gets a Wernicke's aphasia, which is a so-called fluent aphasia. This means they will speak with fluent speech, but it will be meaningless. So watch for speech that lacks stutters and starts and stops, like in Broca's aphasia, but basically the words coming out just don't make any sense. That's what you see when there's a problem with Wernicke's area. It's found in the temporal lobe, not in the frontal lobe like Broca's area. And then sometimes when patients have very large strokes that affect a large region of the left side of the cerebral cortex, they can have damage to both Broca's and Wernicke's areas. And this can lead to a type of aphasia called global aphasia. These patients usually have severely reduced speech function. They're often mute. This usually occurs in the setting of a very large MCA stroke. And because the stroke is so large, these patients have problems beyond just the global aphasia. They have other problems related to extensive central nervous system damage. So you can see things like right hemiparesis from the large left-sided stroke, right sensory loss, and you can also see gaze preference towards the left. Those are those frontal eye field lesions that we talked about earlier. Okay, so now let's go back to our discussion of important regions of the frontal lobe. And the next region that we'll talk about is the prefrontal cortex. This is the anterior 2/3 of the frontal lobe. If you look at this drawing on the slide here, shown in blue is the frontal lobe. And remember, this is the motor cortex right here. But all this part of the frontal lobe out here is the prefrontal cortex. And it's important for higher level thinking and higher level activities, things like what's listed here, problem solving and judgment and personality and emotional traits. So when you get a lesion of the frontal lobe that damages the prefrontal cortex, you're going to get clinical features like what's shown here. These are mostly behavioral changes. So patients can be disinhibited. They can have problems concentrating. They can be disoriented. They can exhibit poor judgment. And then you can also get reemergence of primitive reflexes. I talk about these reflexes in other videos. They're present in newborn babies because their frontal lobe is underformed. But once it develops, they go away. But they can reemerge in patients who have a lesion of the prefrontal cortex. A lot of what we know about the prefrontal cortex comes from a famous injury to a man named Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker in 1848, and he got a railroad iron that went through his skull, but he survived. But afterwards, he had a complete personality change. He had previously been a law-abiding citizen, and he became a drinker and a gambler. And after he died, people looked at his brain and found that there was damage to the prefrontal cortex. And that's how we know a lot about what this region of the brain does. So you can get all these clinical features I talked about in the last slide, the things that happen to Phineas Gage, if you have bilateral frontal lobe injury that damages the prefrontal cortex. Usually this happens because of some type of trauma. So traumatic brain injury is the most common cause of bilateral frontal lobe injury, leading to all these behavioral changes. Let's talk briefly about the olfactory bulb. This is not part of the frontal lobe, but it hangs off the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. It's shown here in this picture. So this is the frontal lobe up here. And we've got this olfactory bulb hanging off here. It sits near a portion of the skull called the cribriform plate. And the olfactory bulb is how we sense smell. It sends signals directly to the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. We'll talk about that in a minute. But importantly, it doesn't send signals to the thalamus. So most of our sensory signals, like vision and sensation and things like this, they go to the thalamus for processing before they go to the cortex. That's not the case for the sense of smell. It goes directly to the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. And if you get destruction of the olfactory bulb for any reason, this will lead to anosmia, meaning loss of the sense of smell. So one of the reasons this can rarely happen is when people develop meningiomas, which are brain tumors that usually occur along the meninges, but they can sometimes develop in the olfactory groove, which is where the olfactory bulb sits. This only happens in about 10% of cases of meningiomas. When this happens, the symptoms you should get will hopefully make sense to you now. You can get anosmia because you compress the olfactory bulb, and then the frontal lobe right here can also get compressed, so that can lead to personality changes. Okay, next let's talk about the parietal lobes. And we mentioned this before, but this is where you find the sensory cortex, the portion of our brain that integrates sensory information from the world around us. Because of this, if there's damage to the right parietal lobe, patients will develop a clinical finding called spatial neglect. So let's talk about what that means right now. So spatial neglect is when you can't perceive objects in one part of space. This is called agnosia. So despite having normal vision and sensation, because of a problem in the parietal lobe, patients don't perceive sensory information from one part of the world. As a result, they will fail to report or respond to stimuli on one side of the body. This only happens with damage to the right parietal lobe, and there's a mnemonic for this: right rule, left less. What this means is that when there's damage to the right parietal lobe, patients have agnosia on the contralateral or left side of their body. That's the side of space that they don't perceive. And the classic way that spatial neglect is tested is by asking the patient to draw an object you show them. So for example, if you show them a normal clock, which starts at 1 and goes down to 6, 3 o'clock is over here and 9 is over here, and you say to the patient, please draw this clock, what they will do is they will draw half of the clock. They will have a 1 here, a 3 here, a 6 here, but they won't draw the left side. And that's because they have left spatial agnosia, and that's because of a right-sided parietal lobe lesion. You generally always see spatial neglect on the left side, like what I just drew with that clock. You almost never see it on the right side. And that's because there's redundant processing of right-sided sensory information by both the left and right brain. So even if you have damage to the parietal lobe on one side, the other side of the brain, the other parietal lobe, can help process information from the right side of space. So what you always want to remember about spatial neglect is that it indicates a lesion of the right parietal lobe, causing left-sided or contralateral agnosia. Also in the parietal lobes, you can find the optic radiations. These are part of the visual pathway that I talk about in detail in videos in the ophthalmology section. So if you have a lesion affecting the parietal lobes and the optic radiations are damaged, what patients will develop is a visual field defect called quadrantenopia. It looks like what's shown on the slide here. Basically, you lose visual field information in the bottom quadrant on one side. The mnemonic for this is that a parietal lobe lesion leads to the pie in the floor lesion, which looks like this. And I go over this in much more detail in videos in the ophthalmology section. Okay, moving on. Next, let's talk about the temporal lobe. This is where you find the primary auditory cortex that integrates auditory sensation or sound sensation from the world around us. So if you get lesions of the temporal lobe, you can potentially develop what's called cortical deafness, which means the inability to hear sounds. Also in the temporal lobe, you find Wernicke's speech area, which we talked about before. You can also find the hippocampus here. This is very important for memory. And then you can also find these three structures here, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in the next couple of slides. So the olfactory cortex we mentioned before, it receives information directly from the olfactory bulb, which as we said earlier is located beneath the frontal lobe. And the place where this sometimes comes up clinically is that patients who have temporal lobe seizures or epilepsy, which are a relatively common form of seizure, they can have olfactory hallucinations. They can smell things that aren't there. And that's because this olfactory cortex is part of the temporal lobe. Also found in the temporal lobe is Meyer's loop. This is another part of the visual pathway. When it's damaged, it can also cause quadrantenopia, just like lesions of the parietal lobe, but it's a different form of quadrantenopia. When there's damage to the temporal lobe and Meyer's loop, what you get is the pie in the sky visual field defect. That looks like this here. Notice that the visual fields that are lost are in the upper visual fields, not the lower visual fields like we talked about earlier. And once again, I go through this in great detail in videos in the ophthalmology section. The amygdala is also found in the temporal lobe. It's a collection of nuclei found in the temporal lobe. It's very important for decision-making and higher brain functions. It's part of the limbic system, which is sometimes called the emotional brain. This is a section of our brain that's important for emotions and motivation and also memory. And so the thing you want to know about the amygdala is that if you get damage to the bilateral amygdala, in other words, to both temporal lobes, to the amygdala region of the temporal lobes, patients will develop a rare neurologic syndrome called the Kluver-Bucy syndrome. This is all caused by damage to the bilateral amygdala in the temporal lobes. So the clinical features of this syndrome include, first of all, hyperphagia. Patients will eat a lot. This will lead to weight gain. They also display hyperorality. This means they have a tendency to want to examine things in the world with their mouth. They can also display inappropriate sexual behavior. Sometimes they will want to do atypical sexual behaviors, or sometimes patients will mount inanimate objects. There can also be visual agnosia. This is the inability to recognize objects that are presented to them visually. And overall, this is a pretty rare syndrome, but the most common reason it happens is patients who have herpes simplex 1 encephalitis. Sometimes after that resolves, as a complication, there can be damage to the amygdala in both temporal lobes, and that can lead to this Kluver-Bucy syndrome. So now that we've talked about all that, hopefully you can understand some of the clinical features of temporal lobe seizures. Focal seizures of the temporal lobe are the most common type of focal seizures, and some of the clinical features that occur are shown on this slide. So first of all, patients often have so-called emotional auras. This is from involvement of the amygdala and the limbic system, so they can note the sudden onset of fear, panic, or anxiety around the time of one of these seizures. Also with temporal lobe seizures, you can see olfactory auras. We talked about this before. Patients will sometimes say they smell foul or burning odors that aren't present. The classic thing is for a patient to describe smelling burning rubber, even though there is no burning rubber. This is an olfactory aura related to the fact that you're having a temporal lobe seizure, and the olfactory cortex is found in the temporal lobe. And then other symptoms you can see are things like staring spells, where patients sort of blank out. Lip smacking is another classic feature. Usually there aren't auditory symptoms, even though the auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. That's because most of these seizures affect the medial structures, and the auditory cortex is a lateral structure. But anyway, after talking about the amygdala and the olfactory cortex, hopefully you can understand why these features here are what you might see in someone who has a temporal lobe seizure or temporal lobe epilepsy. Okay, and then our final lobe is the occipital lobe, which is found in the back of the cortex, the region shown in green here. This is important for visual processing. So lesions of the occipital lobe cause cortical blindness. I'll talk about what this means in a second. The blood supply to the occipital lobe is via the posterior cerebral artery, and so strokes involving this vessel are what can lead to occipital lobe damage and cortical blindness. So the visual field defect you get with cortical blindness from an occipital lobe stroke is called homonymous hemianopsia. So for example, if you have a left posterior cerebral artery stroke, that will damage the occipital lobe on the left side of the body. This will result in right-sided visual loss of both eyes. So this visual field in one eye and this visual field in the other eye will both be lost. This type of visual field defect is called homonymous hemianopsia. On the other hand, if you have a right PCA stroke affecting the right occipital lobe, this will lead to left-sided visual field loss, like what's shown here in this image. Related to homonymous hemianopsia, let's talk about macular sparing. So the macula is the central high-resolution vision area of the retina. It's responsible for things like reading. It has a dual blood supply by the middle cerebral artery and the posterior cerebral artery. What this means is that when patients have a PCA stroke, they will have occipital lobe damage, but the macula will be spared because it will continue to receive blood from the middle cerebral artery. And so if you do very careful visual field testing, and there are techniques that can do this, you can actually identify patients who have homonymous hemianopsia, like what's shown here, but the macula in the center of their vision is spared. And anytime you find this macular sparing in a patient who has homonymous hemianopsia, that always indicates the lesion involves the occipital lobe, that it's a cortical lesion and not a lesion in some other part of the visual pathways that can lead to homonymous hemianopsia. And that concludes our video on the cerebral cortex.